Hi everyone, my name is Sarah and I'll be discussing oxidation scanning probe lithography. Scanning probe lithography is a general term for a technique which uses a sharp tip to induce local patterning of a substrate. And there have been various types of scanning probe lithography that have been developed, and they can be classified based on the type of process that's being controlled at the nanoscale. So it could be thermal, mechanical, electrostatic, chemical, and it's also classified by the method of controlling the probe position. So scanning probe lithography arose in the 1980s as an alternative to electron beam lithography that retained the nanoscale resolution but didn't require as specialized equipment. It wasn't as expensive to operate, and it also didn't require as robust substrates as EBL does. And like electron beam lithography, scanning probe lithography, or SPL, is a maskless process, and they both eliminate the overhead that's necessary to fabricate a mask for each lithography step. So many SPL methods use either a scanning tunneling microscope, or STM, or an AFM to control the position and the height of the tip. So in AFM SPL, the tip surface interaction is governed by the force between the atoms at the bottom of the tip and those of the surface, and the height of the tip is measured by deflecting a laser off the back of the cantilever on which the tip is mounted. In STM SPL, the electric current generated by the tunneling of electrons between the tip and the sample is regulated, and this is what allows the electron density to be measured. And in both of these techniques, the structures are able to be imaged as they're being written, which is a huge advantage of SPL over electron beam lithography. So as we discussed, scanning probe lithography can take many forms, and the method I'll discuss today is oxidation scanning probe lithography because it's one of the most repeatable methods. Oxidation scanning probe lithography was first demonstrated in an STM, where it was found that oxidation of a hydrogen passivated silicon substrate and diffusion of oxygen through the substrate was promoted by applying a voltage between the tip and the substrate in the presence of oxygen. However, STM SPL generally cannot be carried out at standard room temperatures and pressures, so therefore oxidation SPL methods were developed in the AFM, which can be easily equipped with a conductive tip and is generally an easier instrument to acquire and operate. So in AFM SPL, the tip is negatively biased with respect to the substrate. By bringing the tip within nanometers of the sample, the layer of water present on the sample surface due to the interaction with the ambient environment, this water layer will form a meniscus toward the AFM tip. And the sharp tip of the AFM results in a high electric field between the tip and the sample, and this ionizes the water molecules in the meniscus. So the hydroxide ions will then migrate toward the sample due to this electric field, where they can then oxidize the substrate. So here a process model will be developed for AFM, oxidation scanning probe lithography, as it has been demonstrated to be more repeatable than the STM method. So to develop a process model for the meniscus, the parameters that we're interested in controlling are the width and the depth of the oxide line that's written into the substrate. So the depth is how far the oxide extends into the substrate. And additionally, the oxide dielectric function can be controlled, but here we'll limit the discussion to the oxide line dimensions. So the parameters that control the oxide dimensions are the applied voltage of the tip, the relative humidity, the tip to sample distance, and the scan speed. So because the meniscus is what allows the sample and tip to interact, it's really this feature that dictates the final dimensions of the oxide. So we'll first develop a model for the. So next we'll take a look at some of the parameters that influence the oxide line width. First, we'll define the contact area between the sample and the tip in terms of an effective contact parameter measured in amperes. And this is because that's a term that multiplies the current induced in the meniscus. So the effective contact parameter is used because the contact area is not actually constant, because it depends on the interfacial diffusion of ionic species within the meniscus. So it may not necessarily be just the geometrical dimension of that contact between the meniscus and the substrate. So the effective contact area is proportional to the relative humidity, which is indicated by RH, and the thickness of the water layer coating the sample. So that's H, or the height of the water layer in the figure. So first we have an empirical expression for H as a function of the relative humidity. And it makes sense that the height of the water layer and therefore the diameter of the meniscus would depend on the relative humidity, since it's this layer of contamination that's being deposited onto the sample from the surrounding environment. So next we have a geometrical expression for the angle of the tip, which the next parameter of interest is the oxide height, or the depth of the oxide into the surface. We can use the Cabrera-Mott model for metal oxidation to determine how the applied voltage affects the oxide depth. So in this model, which is shown in the figure to the right, the applied voltage serves to create an electric field that enables ions to diffuse through the oxide layer that has initially formed and allows these ions to oxidize the underlying metal. However, when the oxide has reached a critical thickness, this field becomes too weak to lower the activation energy for diffusion, and the oxide becomes self-limiting. Therefore, increasing the applied voltage will increase the thickness for which diffusion of oxygen through the oxide can take place. And in the plot shown to the left, we can also see that as the applied voltage increases, the rate of oxidation increases for a similar reason. And finally, I'll talk briefly about the kinetics of the oxidation process. So oxidation in scanning probe lithography has been shown to occur via both a direct and an indirect mechanism. The direct mechanism is shown in the equation here on the slide, and the indirect mechanism involves a charge defect intermediate. So what happens is the initial oxide layer grows rapidly in height through the direct mechanism, but over time, space charge builds up by the indirect mechanism, which prevents further oxide growth. So to conclude, oxidation SPL in the AFM can be characterized by a straightforward process model, making it one of the most repeatable and well understood scanning probe lithography techniques. It's a direct write process, which means that it doesn't require any subsequent development steps or liftoff, unlike electron beam lithography. And the fabricated structures are imaged in parallel with writing. However, one drawback that scanning probe lithography faces is the low throughput. And similar to electron beam lithography, scanning probe lithography is not a parallel process, which makes it unrealistic for large-scale industry processes. So the next steps in the field of scanning probe lithography are being taken to develop parallel writing processes.